Great. Well, welcome everyone. Okay, so on this episode of Color Space Cadets, I'm Blake Jones, and I'm here with Kevin Shaw, who's going to be manning the chat room, Marc Baxter from ArchiWare. We're going to talk about data for when we're doing restoration, and then Michael Dawson, who has been most recently doing the restoration for the Orson Welles picture Chimes at Midnight. And then we have Bill Malone, director, who has done films such as Feardotcom and also House on Haunted Hill, and of course many other pictures as well. And then Christopher Jones, who has done many documentaries on the film industry as well. And last but not least, John Baxter, a film historian who has done the biography for Stanley Kubrick and Steven Spielberg and even Woody Allen. And so what we're going to do is actually go through and talk with each person, and then we can go through and just discuss, their views on film restoration or image restoration and the importance of preserving our film heritage for the future. And so actually what I'd like to do is actually open up with Bill. Bill, if you can tell me, just give us a little insight about yourself and also about any situations in which you've come across situations for film restoration.
Well, my background is actually, I started out, loving film when I was very young. And I actually started collecting films, primarily 16 millimeter. And then I actually got into 35, collecting film prints that I could get my hands on. And I became aware that, a lot of these things were going by the wayside. I also, as you may know, collect movie props as well for the same reason. But yeah, film is particularly subject to deterioration. And something that I think I'm very interested in. One of the films I recently had to do was restore my own film, which was kind of weird that I'm old enough to have a movie that needs to be restored.
Wow. Which picture was this, or?
It was my first movie called Scared to Death, which was which was shot on an Arri SR 16 standard 16 millimeter, which back in the day was something you'd do, and then it was of course blown up to 35 millimeter in a 1.85 format. So it was tricky,
And of course, of your movie props that you own, you actually have the original Robbie the Robot from Forbidden Planet.
I did actually. I sold him recently just because I felt he needed to go on to be preserved in other hands, and I had him for over 40 years, and that was a wonderful thing, and I still have quite a few props and so forth too.
Well, didn't you make a duplicate of him as well, or was it?
Well, I had built a replica before I actually ever owned the original, which was actually fortunate because when I got the original, he did need some sort of tidying up. And because I had built him, I knew what the issues would be rather than starting from scratch. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's really fascinating because this is a thing, is restoration and preserving the heritage is not just the film, but it's actually all the stuff behind it as well, which is so incredibly important. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, when I started collecting props, that was the time when they were just considered worthless, and things were just getting thrown in the dumpster. And, I went to the guys at MGM and said, all this stuff's going to get destroyed and it's your beautiful work and let's preserve it. And they were very keen on helping me. So God bless them.
Yeah, well, as I remember, I thought, didn't you have like a part of a work print for Forbidden Planet as well? Or
I didn't. That's actually. I'll tell you really quickly what happened was I was going to have a screening of Forbidden Planet over some friend's house who had a little theater in their house, and I'd become friends with B.B. Barron, who was Louis and B.B. Barron, who did the music, the electronic music for it. And she said, would you like to run your print or our print? I had a 35 millimeter, but they had a 16. I said, well, let's run yours. I'd be interested to see what your print is. And of course it started running and suddenly I see clips that say "scene missing," and I see trailers on the, like pencil trailers on the film, and I went,
Oh, wow.
"Oh my God!" And then I start hearing dialogue I've never heard before, and I went, "Holy shit! What do we got here?"
Yeah.
And there's complete scenes that were cut out of the film that were in their print. So, and I prevailed upon them to let me borrow it. And at the time, the only technology we had of transferring it was in 3/4 inch U-matic, but we did it at a good facility. So it's okay, but at least it preserved it. And what happened to that print, I have no idea, but I hope somebody finds it eventually. And
because I saw part of that one time, because there was the scene where they're having lunch with Walter Pidgeon, and they actually, it's supposed to be a disintegrator beam, and when he throws it, it's supposed to, in the film, you just see it go poof like this, it goes up. And in this, you just see it go and hit the floor, and that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, there was no music in the print, and no effects and stuff like that. So yeah, it was pretty interesting, and like even nothing had been dubbed yet. So like Robbie the robot's voice is some some probably grip off the side of the camera going, "Welcome to Altair 4, gentlemen."
Yeah.
Okay.
Was that a cutting copy that you were seeing?
What's that?
Is that a cutting copy?
It was their work print that they had given to Louis and B.B. Barron to do their score with, and they had kept it all those years, and God bless them.
Yeah, and what was amazing too was, I remember when I was doing the color grading for this movie, and I went through and color graded, and I had no idea what the sky was on Altair 4. And that's when I think I called you up on the phone. I said, "Bill, what color is the sky in Altair 4?" Because it was, he comes out and says, "Look at the color of the sky, but I'll still take blue any day." And I had made the sky all blue. So I had to go through and regrade the whole beginning of the picture, The other thing too was, since it was an early CinemaScope film, later CinemaScope pictures, they had a special cement splicer that was created to make the splices much thinner.
It's interesting you say that, because the 35 millimeter print I had was full frame, and you could actually see every splice go by at the bottom of the frame.
Exactly. And this is what would happen was, when I did the color grading, I did the laser disc version for Japan. And I had to take the black borders and just keep moving them down to try to cover up the splices, because it was getting very obtrusive. You see these, cement splices popping in at every scene and all this stuff all over the place. Yeah.
Well, I think what happened in 19, that was a very early CinemaScope film.
Yeah.
And I think right after that, they invented a splicing block specifically for CinemaScope.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because when these early CinemaScope movies that were created, because the first one, of course, was Fox's The Robe. And when The Robe first came out, they had their CinemaScope lens was a little brass box that actually fitted on front of their prime lens. So they had to actually have two focus pullers.
Wow. Yeah.
And so they couldn't really move the camera very much, because they had to have these two guys to continually being in sync. And then what happened was, the movie afterwards was 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And what happened was, they only gave one lens to Disney. And so what happened was that when they went to do the second unit on 20,000 Leagues, they couldn't do any shooting at the studio. And so the special effects guy there at Disney created special models of the Nautilus that were sort of the stubby models. So it was a Nautilus that was squeezed, even to the point that the rivets on the submarine were oval. So this way, when they put it through the CinemaScope lens, it would look the normal size.
Right.
And you can see it shows up in the movie, because when you see the Nautilus going by, it looks normal proportion, but you look at all the coral and it's all stretched out all over the place. Yeah.
It's interesting you mentioned it, because I have one of the CinemaScope lenses from 20,000 Leagues.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. And it's an original Bausch and Lomb thing that they stuck on the front of in front of the thing. Like you said, they had to have two focus pullers.
Yeah,
It's pretty
because what happened was that it was when Fox bought the rights to the CinemaScope process. They came to Paris to Professor Henri Chrétien, and he was the guy who actually sold them the stuff. But he only sold it for large format, 35 millimeter and above. And that's why if you get the 16 millimeter CinemaScope lenses, they actually are still branded with Chrétien's original label, which was Hypergonar. Yeah. And Hypergonar was his original name that he emblazoned upon it. And then basically after that, Fox then trademarked CinemaScope. Yeah.
I have a basic question for everybody on the panel, actually. Blake, when remastering some of the films that we're talking about, how does the panel feel about remastering them as they were originally seen or remastering them for a modern audience sensitivities? Do we change it or do we stick to it? I mean, even things like dirt and marks that would have been on the original, do we remove them or do we keep them as they were?
Well, it's an interesting question because generally when I would do restoration of material, the restoration coordinator who I'd work with on it would say, was that dirt on the film in 1951? If it was there in 1951, we leave it. If it was something that was incurred later, then perhaps we get rid of it. Yeah. But we try to make the colors as close to it was during the original release as possible.
I often think that they really should have Technicolor, find collectors who have Technicolor prints, and they should have them side by side when they're doing the color grading, because I've seen films that I know really well because I've owned Technicolor prints of them, and I see the restoration. I go, well, good job, but it's not Technicolor.
Yeah.
Right. Not so easy though, is it? Because the films fade and
well, Technicolor dye transfer prints don't fade, actually. They always seem to keep their original vibrance because of the dye transfer process.
I understood that the 3 dyes don't age equally, though.
Yeah, maybe a little bit, but nothing that, nothing like an Eastman color fade or anything like that, because I mean, we've had prints. I ran a print of Star Wars one time and it was just like totally green. Yeah.
I had a print of This Island Earth, which I think may have been one of the last films actually shot in 3-strip Technicolor. And it was an old print and it looked like the day it was released. It was gorgeous. Unfortunately, Vinegar Syndrome took it out.
Yeah. And what was interesting about This Island Earth, which was is to make the effect on the planet when they come there and they come to the what was his name, the controller or something like that.
Monitor, yeah.
The monitor, that's it. Yeah. And when they come in there, what they did to achieve the effect was they took the 2 of the matrices and they flipped them around the wrong way.
Yeah. I often think to myself, a color timer who gets that is probably sitting here, what the hell?
Well, this was the funny thing. There was a guy at Universal. It was a gentleman by the name of Mike Fitzgerald who was said, yeah, he went through and he saw a grading that was done of This Island Earth. And he says the guy tried to recorrect that scene. And he says a real, error in judgment there.
Well, as far as base abrasions, emulsion chipping, scratches inherent, to me, those aren't aesthetics. I don't think that, to preserve something, to be such a purist about preservation that you would say, well, wait a minute, let's keep certain dirt artifacts. And I would lump that all together in one classification, say that that's part of preservation as an aesthetic, to me is that I kind of have an issue with. To me, it's to make the image as clean as possible, because I think that's the intent of any filmmaker. I don't think any filmmaker would wish for his work later or as time goes on to have have the imbuement on the part of preservation is to say, well, wait a minute, certain base abrasions and emulsion chipping existed at some certain point in time, and therefore we should preserve them as some benchmark of aesthetics. So that's just my feeling in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing with restoration, was like I've run into a situation when I've been restoring films that it's not just dirt and scratches, but I've actually had physically bits of the film missing or reels swapped around. Right. One of them was one time I was doing a picture called Dr. X with Lionel Atwill. And what happened was, as I was working on it, I said, there's some real continuity wrong. First reel, he's inside the house, and then the next reel, he's outside, and then all of a sudden he's back inside the house, locked in the same room. And so I called up somebody at MGM and I said, do you have anything on Dr. X that I can use for reference? And they, all of a sudden, a courier came by with this big plastic crate, and they brought it in, and it was the original shooting script of Dr. X. And I went through and found out that reel 2B and 3A were inverted, you know.
Well, that's an issue where you're essentially fixing an inadvertent problem that occurred.
Yeah, but the thing was, apparently it had been that way for something like 10 years before somebody figured it out. Yeah,
doesn't make it right. Chris, you're going to say?
Yeah, I was wondering if it was better inverted.
Well, no, it's actually a pretty good movie. It's actually kind of a crazy film, really, for the era. And
I love Dr. X. I got to tell you,
the Moon Killer. The Moon Killer. Yes.
the color on it is sensational. 2-strip Technicolor.
Exactly.
And as a filmmaker, I go, how can I get my movie to look like that? You know?
Yeah. Well, that was funny. We're talking about Technicolor. Was that I went for a job interview for a company in Copenhagen, and they said, they pulled out this laser disc and they said, now, as far as we're concerned, this is the gold standard. This is what Technicolor should look like. And this is and it was a Bob Hope and Virginia Mayo film called The Princess and the Pirate. And he went through and played it. He says, you see, that's what Technicolor should look like. And I told him, I said, yeah, I'm the guy who did the color correction for you. I got the job, you know. But this is true. I mean, but with that time, Goldwyn, when they were doing all of the, basically it was the monopack versions of this, they did CRIs for all of their Technicolor pictures. And CRIs are not the best elements to work with, but you could make nice looking Technicolor on it. You know, It looked good. It looked like a dye transfer print, you know.
Well, I have a question.
Sure.
All you restoration fanatics. I made a film with Marie-Dominique Montel about the history of Babelsberg Studios in Berlin, famously featuring John Baxter, by the way. And we talked extensively about AGFA film and AGFA color. Now you're talking an awful lot about Technicolor restoration. What about AGFA color restoration? Because one of my all-time favorite movies is, of course, Baron Munchausen. So who has, we've got Marc and you, Blake, are in Germany. What about AGFA?
Good question. I mean, I've worked a lot with AGFA, and it's kind of a different beast from Technicolor. It has a different look to it. And it's more, I found it was almost a more pastel look to the whole thing all the way across.
Their claim to fame, though, was that they put twice as much silver in the green emulsion to make it look sharper. But when I was using it back in the early 80s, it was mostly on natural history because it could pick up, greenery in a way that Kodak film certainly couldn't. It was very popular. It was very sad when it disappeared.
Yeah, actually, I was working with it in the middle of a film, and it was being shot on AGFA, and they actually ceased production in the middle of the production.
Awkward.
Yeah, so that made it a little difficult for matching and stuff like this. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, somebody would need to map the color gamut so that we could accurately portray it.
Yeah.
It's hard to do that when you can't get any raw stock anymore. That would
this is true.
That would be the easy way to do it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Mark, we haven't heard from you yet. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, in this crowd, I'm probably the one touching film the least because I have to do with data, and I'm working in a software company. We do archive software, backup and cloning software. So the people who do restoration or film production nowadays need software to handle all of this piles of data. And so we help them with that. I have seen some of those technical devices, and that's very, very big projectors and everything are quite fascinating. But actually, the digital fashion is where I have most contact with. And coming back to this question, how preservation could be directed or what direction it could take, is I would see it in a way that if people would have had the choice at the time to have more accurate color or more f-stops or more whatever technical quality, they would have chosen that. So like if you think about classical composers or something, if they would have had an orchestra like we have today, or a larger piano like we have today, or a synthesizer, they would have chosen that, obviously. So I
totally agree.
Yeah, so I would say even upscaling the resolution to, I've seen some historical things upscaled to 4K, and that's amazing because you feel you're part of the scene suddenly. It becomes real life. Whereas if you would see it in the original lower resolution, there's much more distance psychologically.
And the Lumiere brothers has been remastered in 4K. It looks amazing.
Yeah.
This is true. I say something related to the question of color. One thing I was struck with recently was looking at a colorized version of Michael Curtiz's The Kennel Murder Case and thinking, gosh, it's really an improvement. I love that film. It's brilliant in black and white, one of his best films. And yet the colorizing brought out values in it, particularly textures. You were able to see the difference between different sorts of fabric and the difference between metal and stone. So it gave a real sense of immediacy to many of the scenes. In a way, if people could in the past have wished for anything, what they might well have wished for was to have the film in color rather than black and white. I wonder if people think there is a creative future for colorizing.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I think colorizing has come a long way since Color Systems Technology and these other companies like that, because those used to be just, horrendous looking. And the latest things that I've seen that have actually been colorized have actually not been that bad. They've actually been quite good. And so I think what you're saying is quite true. I think it, for once, it breathes new life into the film. And also it allows you to see things that maybe you had missed in the black and white version of the picture as well. Because I remember this movie very well. I think this was the pre-runner to the Nick Charles pictures, wasn't it? The Thin Man films.
No, actually, it's an SS Van Dyne, Philo Vance.
Oh, Philo Vance, that's it. Yeah, yeah.
The same family, you're quite right.
Yeah.
Blake, we're getting some questions in the chat now. The first one is a really good one about scanning reversal film, particularly Kodachrome, even down to 8mm, Super 8mm home movies. Can you say something about restoring 8mm Kodachrome, which is obviously quite tricky because of the color space?
Well, actually, Kodachrome, the thing about Kodachrome is it's extremely contrasty. it does hold its color over long periods of times. It's very similar to almost like dye transfer. And so, I mean, the colors does retain over years. I mean, for example, if you look at the original Abraham Zapruder film and things like this, that was the Kennedy assassination, and these was Kodachrome, and it was shot 8mm, and the film is still holding up, basically. Yeah.
But how do you deal with that contrast? Do you put more light through it and lose the?
You have highlights? You basically, what I do is I round off the highlights and I stretch the gamma just a little bit. But the film is inherently supposed to have a certain contrast to it, so I try to retain what's there already. And so it's just basically what happens is on film scanners, they have trouble trying to pierce through that deep contrast. And so we try to just sort of, find a good way around it. It's like doing a color grading of a projection print or something like that.
Have you ever tried doing multiple scans, combining multiple scans?
Yeah, I did this. I did an HDR scan of it, and this worked out pretty well because what happens is on a film scanner, when you're trying to pump a lot of light through it, and if it's really dark material, you're going to start getting the sensor noise will start coming through. And in order to get around that, if you do 2 passes and basically what was a 4K scan becomes an 8K scan, because you're doing a high area and low area and putting it together, and then you get a much better quality from it. Yeah.
There's another comment about the same topic, which I think is also a good one. The color gamut of film, obviously being analog color dyes, is clearly outside of Rec. 709. So what is the best color space to be doing these restorations in?
I usually just go within Rec. 709 and then just try to compress things as because, for example, different film stocks, and whether you're dealing with interpositive, internegative prints or anything like this, it's all going to react differently. And so this is what you have to contend with on it. So there's no steadfast rule actually to work with. Yeah.
But for total accuracy, an HDR, even if you don't use the dynamic range, but an HDR scan in 2020 would potentially give you a bit more color, a bit more closer to the original.
Yeah, you could do that. Yeah, you could do that actually. And this would work fine. I mean, I saw recently the HDR scan of 2001, but I don't know what doesn't look. It looks a bit warmer than I would imagine it to be, because if you look at the CAV laser disc, which is the one I color graded, it's a much cooler look on it. And if you look at the 4K HDR version inside the Discovery with Dave Bowman looking at his face is like totally red. Yeah.
I wonder what reference they used. Not the Laserdisc, obviously.
Yeah. I'm not sure what happened there. Yeah.
I have a question, which is if I'm preparing a movie to be projected in a theater, what is the gamma setting that I should be using there? What's the gamma for standard projection, theatrical?
Good question. I would say it was something about 2.4 or something like that.
A theatrical projection should be 2.6 normally, because
or 2.6. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, 2. Exactly.
6.
Yeah, because it's a totally dark room.
Yeah.
Simultaneous contrast. 2.6 should look more or less the same as 2.4 at home.
Are you, Bill, when you're doing your pictures, are you doing digital intermediates on everything, or how are you doing it?
No, I mean, it depends on, I mean, a lot of stuff I'm shooting on film, but the digital stuff, I'm basically just going directly to, an output of some sort, like a DCP or something like that, or
exactly,
through like a usually what do you call it, Apple ProRes or something.
Yeah, because what was interesting was I did a picture in Rome called The Shadow. And what we did is they shot 35 negative, scanned it into DPX files, and then I graded that. And then what we did was we were grading in the grading theater, and to make sure that we were on the right track, we went through and rendered out a day shot, a night shot, an interior shot. And then what we did is like what we call a wedge test. And then we printed that out on 3 different types of film stock. And then looked at it in the screening room. And we said, okay, this film stock, it's going too yellow. This one's a little too blue. This one's too contrast. We look, oh, okay, that one looks just like how it looks like in the grading theater. And then we said, okay, all the prints will be done on that guy. Yeah.
I think this is one thing that's so frustrating for me about digital. It's just like, yes, I know there's a standard, but nothing seems to ever be that standard.
Well, exactly. Yeah. And there's so many variables that can change the color all the way through.
That
and
was
this
true
was
in
the thing.
cinema as well, wasn't it? I mean, cinemas were not lined up. In fact,
I kind of liken it myself to, like, when I used to produce records years ago for, like, rock and roll records and stuff. I was, what you do is you play your record on like cheap speakers, and then then on a big full
Exactly.
system, and you try to find some balance where it all looks or sounds the same. So I've been sort of doing the same thing with digital stuff.
Or the funny story when I was working on this picture was all of a sudden I'm grading it, and I look down at the viewer and I see these black blobs in the picture, and I looked on the screen and I say, well, it must be some dirt on the porthole behind where the projector is. So I'm over there cleaning it. And then I looked down at the viewer on Resolve and I saw the black blobs there. And then I realized what had happened was that the guy who did the scanning, he cleaned the gate, of course, after, but what he did was he, instead of cleaning it and then going through and doing an alignment, he aligned it and then he cleaned the gate. So what he did was he wrote the dust into the shading map for the film scanner. So that meant that everything that was scanned had this dirt printed into it.
A problem on my film Scared to Death when I was restoring that is I had grabbed the original negatives. I still had the original camera, original negatives. And of course it was on, because it's 16 millimeter, it's on A and B rolls. And people watching who don't know what that means is you had to like have 2 rolls of film with alternating black between the cuts so that the printer would be able to print it out as one thing, because of the edits. You didn't want to see the edits. And because of that, over the years, the black filler had started shedding.
Oh, no.
It was a nightmare. It was a nightmare.
Right.
Well, this was the thing, too, was that what people don't realize when they're doing restoration of films, even 35 millimeters, sometimes they used AB rolls for it.
Right.
Or one time when I was doing the first laser disc for The Graduate. And what they did is they had a weird negative that they used at the time. It was called a function negative. And this negative was, they had these strips of film that were spliced in, and they were designed to fire off optical printers. And so it's like the whole beginning scene of the picture where Dustin Hoffman is walking through the airport, and they had all these effects for the titles to fade in and out. It was on another roll, and you had this sort of function tape that would go through. And here I am with a film on a telecine, and you're playing it through, and you're saying, what the heck is this? Yeah. And so we ended up having to get it interpositive, because at least it had all this stuff, these effects already printed into it, because the original neg for us was useless.
Well, I think that's what Harry Saltzman had in mind in regards to his master negative. Essentially, there was the original camera negative, which was AB rolled, and he created an assembled AB roll negative. So essentially, he made a negative from a negative without going through an interpositive. But in doing that, he assembled it in such a way that everything is intact, as if it were a dupe negative, essentially. So
it's interesting, yeah.
But save the generation.
So, Michael, let's get onto your restoration of Chimes. So, how long did you actually take to do the restoration completely from?
Well, it's kind of it's a strange story there, because it all started off with I attended the the first academic symposium on Welles after he died in '85 was held in New York City at NYU Film School. I think William Sullivan was the chair of the department at the time. And I sent in a documentary film crew because everybody was going to be there. Everybody, some great scholars. James Nairmore was the master of ceremonies. He opened the symposium. He wrote The Magic World of Orson Welles. But everybody was there, from Ruth Warwick, Arthur Anderson from the play Julius Caesar, when it was a Mercury Theater. Tommy Anderson, who was the sub for Mr. Carter from the All Voodoo Macbeth, was there. I mean, I'm just trying to give you a gambit of how many different people were there that all had something to do with Welles. Anyways, we were at the Joseph Papp Theater, and I think Oya Kodar was there. And I saw this print of Chimes, which was just absolutely remarkable. And I had known for years that there were some elements that were pristine that were unavailable, and that's all I could get from that. I used to work for Audio Brandon Films, which had the largest international 60 millimeter catalog in the world. It was a subsidiary of Macmillan Publishing, and they would take. I knew that from people like Worms or Peppercorn, they would. Their dupe negs would get bad, and they would take prints and use those as interpositives to make additional dupe negs off those prints. And as you know, using a soundtrack off a composite negative is usually not the way to go, but it's a backup soundtrack in terms of having something in terms of an optical source. So anyways, there were different things that always bothered me about the film, and that is that, there was one scene where, for instance, you see this horse clearly neighing, you don't hear him. And I had, when I saw this print, you could hear him neighing. And so I thought, wow, it was the most bright, crisp, clear soundtrack I'd ever seen, much less have a very high quality image. So I immediately went to the projectionist and I said, where did this print come from? And he couldn't reveal it. That part of the deal of being able to show that print was the anonymity of the provider of the print. So that's when the search began. So in the end, to make a long story real short, I was able to find out who provided the print, and they were able to provide me with a source in regards to this assembled AB roll negative that was made from the original camera negative, as opposed to going through an interpositive. So we had to clear the rights, and the legal story on it is that's a separate podcast, I can assure you, in regards to all the components and details in that regard. But we used an ARRI scan, and we did a 6K scan of it, we basically used the Pixel Farm PF clean software, and the grading was done. It was a base light grading system, and one of the things that I was involved with in the early 90s was doing beta test on the revival system, which was basically began in Singapore. The government of Singapore financed the research, the R&D on it with the University of Singapore to come up with this system that would eliminate, using an algorithm system, would eliminate base abrasions and emulsion chipping and what have you, and or just general dirt that had been embedded. And based on the idea that if it only lasted for a frame or two, then it didn't belong. And so that had to be beta tested. And of course, that system gave a number of other systems, but it basically allowed digital cleanup to go essentially from the horse and buggy to the automobile. Because before then, it was used discrete logic where you would take a particular artifact and you would let it bleed through to the next frame or the next 2 frames, or perhaps as far as 3 frames, to where it didn't exist. And if you're spending 2 to 3 minutes per frame and you're talking 24 frames a second, you can see how it becomes a labor-intensive situation, and financially is almost not feasible. So the revival system allowed film restoration to kind of enter a new era in terms of economic viability. So anyways, but we just did an HDR treatment on it. And what's interesting about HDR is it seems to be almost more effective in black and white than color, which I was unaware of. And I still haven't quite wrapped my brain around the HDR process in terms of light wavelength, et cetera. But There's when the demo, we did a demo. I just wanted to, and what motivated me to finally pull the trigger on it was the fact that I'd seen this documentary on black and white still photography that a photographer was doing in caves in Europe. And when I saw the difference, I said, well, that might be interesting to apply to Chimes. And so, well, there's a famous scene at the famous Battle of Shrewsbury scene where Wells is giving the Shakespeare ode to the virtues of drinking sack, which was a Portuguese sherry wine that the aristocracy drank. And of course, during the film, he drinks sack all throughout the film. And he's giving this speech, and I'm looking at the 4K monitor. We did a 6K, but it was compressed to 4K. And I'm looking at the 4K monitor. We can't have them on the same monitors because due to the file differential. And the 4K looks gorgeous, but then in the HDR, you see the sun glistening off of his chainmail that you just never saw, and you don't see it in 35 millimeter. So going back to the earlier suggestion that that filmmakers would, if given the technology to allow certain visual virtues to come through aesthetically that way, I think is something that most would adhere to wanting, and so we're real pleased with the outcome visually.
Well, we've got the trailer here for it that you put together. So let's have a look at that, actually. Oh, yeah. And then we can see this here. 1 second. Let me just get this ready here. And just 1 second. Come back to here. Share this and just optimize it. Okay. And got this like so. And we come over here.
Canadian-born Harry Saltzman became one of Europe's most illustrious and eclectic motion picture producers of the last half of the 20th century. In 1965, by providing completion funds, he produced Orson Welles' most personal, yet epic masterpiece, Chimes at Midnight. Unavailable for decades, now comes a 6K restoration of Chimes at Midnight using the Harry Saltzman Master Negative.
Okay, there we have it.
Wow, that was impressive.
Yeah.
Where will that be shown, Michael?
Well, we're right now we're in a benefit stage. We're doing, because of COVID, and that threw a couple of wrenches into the logistics, as you can imagine, in terms of getting it done. And we basically got permission to have a benefit campaign for about 4 or 5 different categories. One being theater groups that were obviously affected by COVID. Historic movie theaters in terms of restoration funding. Cancer was another one. I forget, there's 2 other categories I can't think of right offhand, but we're going to have a screening up in Kenosha, Wisconsin, which is Orson Welles' birthplace, and his parents are buried there. And the home has been preserved and it's now in the National Register. So we're going to be doing a number of other benefits. We're even thinking about doing a benefit for Ukraine. So it's kind of expanded. We've just recently been in communication, and we hope it goes forward, to do a benefit for the Hollywood Sign Trust and Foundation. I think it's Foundation and Trust, actually, which is a not-for-profit organization responsible for the maintenance of the Hollywood sign. So we've kind of spread that beneficial blanket out farther than what the original core categories were. So after we're doing after that, then we will be shopping it, and so we're looking forward to it being a general distribution.
And how long was the period that you spent restoring the film?
Well, it was a stop and go, so it's kind of hard to put that in frame. I mean, it took about a year to do. One of the promises we had, in fact, we were invited next in December. We're going to be making a presentation at the Association of the Moving Image Archivists conference in Pittsburgh. It's called Problems and Solutions, and one of the things that we did is we kind of got risky with it. We had some original stem tracks, and the original optical negative we had transferred at 96 hertz as opposed to 48 hertz. The problem with that is you get the prime soundtrack like you've never heard it before, but you get any hiss or roll or optical roll hiss or any audio aberration and artifacting that exists gets multiplied by a factor of 20. I mean, you've got this wonderful frequency response. You've got essentially broadcast frequency response, but anything that's outside of the primary soundtrack is also greatly amplified. And so what we had to do is, we had to carve away at it using some proprietary software prior to even my getting a hold of the original elements. When I got a hold of some stem elements before I even got a hold of this master negative and its elements. But it was the idea of eliminating all that noise, essentially, if I could make a general categorization without digging into the primary soundtrack. So I think we've done, we only had to do a little bit of reconstruction because of that, going into the primary audio on, I think, no more than 7 effects altogether, but everything else is there, and it's just the soundtrack was the same soundtrack by the composer who did the score for Orson Welles' Othello that I was involved in restoring with Orson Welles' daughter Beatrice back in the early 90s. And anyways, and that was much more of an organic restoration as opposed to this digital effort. But anyways, that took some time to do, and we needed to refine it. And in some cases, we made it too clean. And then what was excellent about it was the fact that we had these presence tracks that had never been heard before, and so that was the other advantage we had. But we wanted to make sure that that it was done correctly, and that so that there's moments of silence. The only ambiance in that silence is the presence of that room, as opposed to any other artifacting or hiss. So anyway, so to answer your question, it took, you could say it took 2 years, but again, if we were to compress it so that it was a 9 to 5 operation, I would say it would took about 4 months, but it was spread out over a long period of time. Just due to the logistics of having to do what we had to do during COVID. So,
But it's interesting about restoration of films. It can vary on the amount of time, depending on the budget also of the customer. When I was in Denmark, we did the restoration of For a Fistful of Dollars, and this was shot in 2-perf Technivision. And so what happened was that Sergio Leone shot on short ends because he had a very limited budget during that time. And the problem is that dirt that would normally be this big on a 35 frame on a 2-perf, it becomes this big. Yeah. And so we had to do a lot of dust busting on it to try to fix this. And basically the end game for this was to create a 4 perforated high 35 millimeter negative of the picture and cleaned up, and this is what they were using. And then they also wanted to make a Blu-ray version of it afterwards in the end. And so this is what we did for the picture. But the negative was, it was basically 250 hours of dust busting to go through and fix it and clean it up. Yeah.
I wanted to ask everyone a question. I've heard this, I don't know that it's true, but I've heard that like Warner Brothers, even on their digital films, breaks them down into YCM film, and that's what they archive.
Well, this is interesting you say that, because John, when you worked with Kubrick on his biography, did he ever mention anything about his restoration or archival things for his movies, or?
Not particularly, but I did have some adventures with restoration when I was looking into his early films, and I looked for a copy of Fear and Desire and had to go up to Eastman House in Rochester to see the only existing, it seemed, 35 millimeter print, which I managed to break on the moviola, but luckily it was a Duke. But I found that a lot of the early films there was almost nothing. Some of his things like Day of the Fight and so on, they exist in very bad 16 millimeter, and he never went made any effort to try and restore them. But of course he was fanatical about having the more recent films properly screened. He would send people around to put in new aperture plates into all of the cinemas so that you would have exactly the right framing. And of course, for stills, he would only use frame blow-ups. So he was a man who lived in the moment. He didn't look back that much. He tended to look on the past as done and finished, and he concentrated exclusively on what he was doing at the time.
Yeah, because I remember the story where he actually did color separations for Barry Lyndon and Shining and things like this, and these certain types of titles, because and he would have them stored. I think it was in a salt mine they were storing them, just to have the best, storage conditions over a long period of time. Because if he did 3 color separations, then he didn't have any trouble with, fading situations and stuff like that. Mm-hmm.
Kodak offered a service where the separations were put onto black and white stock.
Mm-hmm.
I had the opportunity to work with, briefly with Leon Vitali, who was Stanley's, essentially his man Friday on a technical level. There's an excellent documentary, Film Worker, that I suggest everybody see. And he talks about Warner Brothers in terms of trying to supervise them in terms of color correction on 2001: A Space Odyssey. And but I worked with Michael Matuzik at the time was iCube Studios, and I was able to have the opportunity to restore the Seafarers, the Flying Padre, and Day of the Fight. Now that was just a visual restoration, but that was using, again, the revival system in it. I think this was around 2005. But that's hopefully they're being distributed. But we were able to make them look pretty clean, that's for sure. But I wanted to shout out to Mike Matuzik and Nolo. They did a fantastic job. And then our sound work that we did on Chimes was done at Stranded on a Planet. Scott Fritz was the head technician in that regard. So anyways, but I just wanted to throw that in just because Orson Welles and Stanley Kubrick are my two guys, so to speak.
May I ask a question to all of you?
Sure.
Since you're restoring films and finally scan them, and then you end up with files. So what happens to those files? How do you handle them? Where do they go? How are they preserved?
Well, that's a really good question. Yeah, because this is the thing that mainly people try to store them in some way possible, but the fact is that years down the line, sometimes these file formats are no longer readable, or sometimes where they've archived them to is readable either, And this was a problem that, for example, NASA had. They went through and they shot some digital photographs from these deep space probes, and they stored them away, and they went back and looked at it 20 years later. And first of all, the disk was, they couldn't read the disk at first. And secondly, the format that was on the disk, they couldn't even read that afterwards once they finally got into it. So this is the thing why a lot of people are archiving on film, because they know that maybe over 100 years down the line, they can still see the stuff back and get to it. Now, what Warner Brothers did on The Godfather, which I thought was pretty ingenious, was they took about 3 or 4 frames in the Academy leader in the beginning of the picture, and they miniaturized the entire restoration process, what they did to restore the movie, and encoded that into the leader. So if you go through, look there, and you zoom in and look at it, it's got all the documentation, everything's there, it's all on the film, and they did it in 3 color separations. So this way, they never had trouble of it fading or everything, and they knew that maybe 50 years down the line, it's still going to be there. Yeah.
Not going to be very accessible, though. I mean, the digital answer to that is LTO tape moving into cloud object-based storage is the way that it's going. We're really close to the hour. The last question from the audience is, could you offer some advice to young people who would like to get into the film restoration industry? Marc, maybe you'd like to start the panel off.
Okay. Who would like to answer on this? Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll take it. I'll pick it up. Yeah. Yeah. And when you want to get started in restoration, I think the main thing you want to do is probably be aligned with an archive somewhere. And this is a good way to get your feet wet in doing restoration. So for example, let's say like the Munich Film Museum or something like this, or for example, the British Film Institute in Berkhamsted is a wonderful place to learn about restoration there. They have a fantastic restoration department there. And this is a way that if you really want to learn restoration, they have a physical restoration department, and they also have a digital department as well. Because this is the thing that's interesting, is that certain studios have different ways of approaching restoration of movies. And for example, like studios like Universal, for example, what they'll do is they'll start out by doing a wet gate scan of the original negative. And then afterwards, they will digitally approach the certain scenes that need to be done digitally. So like the guy said, I don't want to digitally restore the entire movie from head to tail, because that's like trying to fix a plate glass window with a brick. He said, I just want to do only the scenes that need to be done. And this is what they had to do with Jaws, because with Jaws had the problem where the studio did they made all of the release prints from the original negative and they wore it out.
Right.
And because normally what would happen so what people don't know is that when you have a movie that's going into the theater in the photochemical realm, basically from the original negative, you make an interpositive, which it looks like a negative, but it's a positive image on negative stock. That area, that piece of film is used for creating the internegatives. The internegative is what you use for making your release print from. So normally a film like Jaws would have maybe about 7 or 8 internegatives, because when one gets worn out, then they make another one from the interpositive, and then they continue going all the way down. And it's interesting because like when we were working on Poltergeist, I had 5 internegatives there. And if you looked at internegative number 2, it was really thrashed, and if you looked at the latest one, it was in really good shape because they hadn't used it that much. But if you went back to the interpositive was pristine, always. So what the idea was always is to do it this way. So this way the original negative can sit in the vault and it doesn't get touched.
Right.
But what happened was Universal made all the prints from the original negative, wore it out. So it was all full of rips and tears and scratches and everything all through the whole picture. So what they ended up having to do was do a wet gate scan from the original negative, fix all the rips and the tears digitally, and then make a new negative afterwards in the end. And actually Spielberg in the end of the day said that it looks better than the original one when it came out, because when Jaws first came out, it was a mono show. And they did a Dolby 5.1 mix. And so the restored version actually has stereo sound on it. Yeah.
It's amazing though that you've got a studio, and you would think that they would have technicians because you normally, even if you're using a second generation dupe neg, it's usually no more. You don't roll more than 50 prints off of it. That's kind of the general rule. Anything more than that, then the thing's going to begin to fall apart. But the fact that they were using an original negative that way is actually quite astonishing.
Well, and this was interesting because I was doing a picture one time called Bring on the Night with this director, Michael Apted. And as I'm doing the color grading with him, the phone rang. And it was MGM Film Labs. And they said, what are you using for Bring on the Night? And I said, I'm grading from the original negative. And he said, don't use it, because they used the original 35 neg to make the 65 millimeter wet gate blowups with, because it was a 70 millimeter release.
Right.
And he said, because if you run that negative through that solution so often, you are eventually going to make all splices come undone. So he says, your chances are, he said, you're going to end up with a break somewhere along the line.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that is correct.
And so I jumped to the internegative at that point. I said, well, I'm more than happy to use the internegative. That's fine with me.
Regarding Jaws, they didn't know what they had. I remember when it first opened, it opened in some little dive theater at the end of Hollywood Boulevard. And after the first week, they had lines around the block. And then Universal went, oh, maybe this is good.
Well, the funny story about Jaws was that it used to be at Disney Studios, every Thursday night, they would have an executive screening where they would have movies from other studios that would come around. And they would usually run it in one of the small projection rooms in the animation building. And my dad said, oh, we're going to run Jaws tonight at the studio. And when we got there, they said, oh, because so many people wanted to see the film, they moved it out of there and they put it into the main theater at the studio and they ran it there.
Well,
John Baxter may know about the situation with 2001: A Space Odyssey. It was initially horrible because back in those days, when they booked a film, they had to book for a particular contract period of time. In other words, if it didn't have legs now, they can let it go. But back then, if it was a 3-week or a 4-week or a 6-week booking, it had to stay the entire time, regardless of audience attendance. And they thought they had a bomb on their shelf. And Cara Dulé came and as part of the 50th anniversary of 2001: A Space Odyssey, came to the Pickwick, which has a brand new Christie 4K laser projection system. And he said basically the hippies saved it. They began attending it, obviously, and taking everything from peyote mushrooms to good old Mexican marijuana, and word got around, and pretty soon the lines were around the block. And so I think that 2001: A Space Odyssey was essentially saved by the counterculture at the time.
If I can just take a second, I'd like to tell you a quick story.
Had them excited. The rest of the film, well, there was no drug effect particularly, but they wanted the psychedelic effect of that second last reel.
Well, I wanted to say something. Speaking of things that people didn't know what they had, Star Wars in 1977, I happened to have been invited to a screening of it, which was the studio executive screening, which they had at 9 o'clock in the morning, which is the worst possible time you can screen a movie. And all the executives were in there. And the night before, there was an article in the LA Times interviewing George Lucas, and he was saying, "I made this movie, and it's terrible, and this is going to be the last movie I'll ever be able to make." And then at the screening, they started the screening, and George Lucas was sitting right, like in the next seat in front of me, off to one side, and the main titles came over, the spaceship comes over, and all of the audience, which these are film executives, stood up and started cheering. And I look over and there's a tear running down George Lucas's cheek.
Interesting.
Yeah, Chris, you want to say something?
Yeah, the question was what young people who would like to get into film restoration. I just saw and had to make a small little snippet for an academy about painting restoration in the area, and the fellows said something very interesting. Obviously, they have their methods, but it is taking something, restoring its brilliance, and passing it on to the next generation. And I think that is a guiding philosophy of any film restoration. It is to take the original and make it in a proper, pristine state to be able to be passed on. I don't really think it's to play games with the future, how it could have looked like, what the director may have wanted. Obviously, as Michael said, it shouldn't be. Nobody wants to have dirt on their film, but I think that's the guiding principle, and it's a very curious thing that we've been talking a lot about the technicalities of preservation, digitalization, and so on. But in the end, I can only give you one anecdote. I was sitting in a cafe in the Deux Magots on Boulevard Saint-Germain to meet a producer one morning, and I looked out. Of course, it's early in the morning, and I saw a man with an old tripod and a plate glass camera photographing just, buildings, people, and so on, with the thing over his head, And I went over and talked to him, and he said, "I'm the last plate photographer in Paris, except for one place, the observatory. The people in the observatory who photograph the stars always preserve on plate glass because it's the most stable preservation known." So the old is not necessarily the bad. And
that's true. That's true.
It's an interesting event that and I think we all have to keep this, because there are obviously people looking at this in mind. And well, I think I'm going to say goodnight to you all because I have to go eat. But I think that restoration, I was curiously, there was another event today. an email from Serge Bromberg, who has found the pieces of a lost Jean Gabin film called Mephisto, 1931, and it's going to be premiered in Lyon. So lost things are always being found. We're putting them together as they wish to be done. But I think it is a wonderful industry, a wonderful art form, the seventh art, yes, indeed. Well, let's see how it goes. I mean, I personally love the brilliance of nitrate film. So,
well, this is the thing. I was just about to say that. And I think nitrate film has gotten a bad rap through the years. Everybody talks about it being explosives and blah blah. But the thing is that nitrate film, you get the best tonal range for doing any work with it. If you look, when we did the work on the Sherlock Holmes films with Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce, they gave us a choice. They said, here's the nitrate and here's the safety film. And I screened both of them and I looked at it, and the nitrate looked so good that I said, okay, I'm going to use the nitrate. The tonal range, the grayscale through the nitrate film looked fantastic. And even the old color Technicolor films, we did an old 2-color film called Mystery of the Wax Museum. And this was nitrate 2-color Technicolor. And you have to grade it in a certain way to get that proper sort of blue greenish tone to the picture, to get that sort of, it has a weird sort of tone value into it. And I saw somebody who did a grading one time and they made it all purple, and I was like, this is terrible, but 2-color Technicolor, if you do it the right way it's supposed to be, it can look very, very beautiful. And nitrate, if you handle it properly, you can get wonderful results off of it.
Yeah, it's not all that unstable. It's just a matter of environmental conditions.
Well, this is true. This is totally true. And if it's stored properly, because the thing with nitrate film is it has to breathe. So when you store it, the secret for nitrate film is to remove the core from the center of the film and then put it in this way. So this way it allows the film to expand and contract. If you leave the core inside, it will actually decompose quicker. And I've seen at some periods where the film contracted around the core to the point that it reduced the plastic core into powder.
Getting back to the question of the young people getting into the restoration business, I think John Baxter could attest to what Kubrick said about people wanting to become filmmakers. Get a camera and start shooting. So in regards to restoration, find some old, speaking of 8mm, whether it's regular 8 or super 8, and see if it needs restoring and pursue it to the end that you can, based on what resources you have. And doing is learning. And start
this
there.
Is true. Yeah, this is very true. Mm-hmm.
I wanted to say one thing to the audience out there, and that is, when I came to Los Angeles in 1967. I saw a 16mm print of London After Midnight. Okay. I've seen the movie, and I know that whoever has it probably still has that 16mm print. So cough it up.
The first way to get into restoration is find the film.
Exactly. This is true. This is the thing. That's part of the restoration process, is playing detective, and this is it. Very true, John. Yeah.
Obviously, there are tons of lost film.
Yeah.
And there are obvious candidates, but for restoration, and there, of course, are favorites, and so on and so forth. I just was finished a restored copy of War and Peace, the Soviet version, the Bondarchuk version. Oh my God, it's like paintings, constant paintings. And they did a very good restoration, I think. But it's all over the place. It's just a matter of going out and doing, as those people doing in Rochefort, doing painting restoration. It is a matter of finding the painting and then restoring it as it should look. And then we go from, go to the races from there. Good night,
Yeah.
everyone.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay, thanks a lot.
We do have to
Okay.
wrap it up now. We're over time. But I really appreciate your stories and your encouragement for the audience. And I'm sure that there'll be a lot of people motivated to look up some old film.
And thanks everybody for attending. It was really great. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye, everybody.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Bye-bye. Bye.